Alright, so back to this. This is going to be a different video, as you can tell by the title, right? If you're a random person stumbling upon the channel, or if, like, let's say this is the first Rejuvenation video you've seen of mine, you know this is a character I hold very near and dear to my heart, and probably, like, I know for as much as I jokingly glaze him, probably one of my favorite characters in the game, and I'm going to talk about him now, because I think he's a character that's quite frankly underappreciated, and I don't want to say underappreciated in, like, you know, people like shit on him, but more so I think people undervalue or like gloss over his character, and that's something I'm gonna go more in depth to right now, to try and kind of flesh out his character and do like a little analysis on my own part, kind of what I see is like, let's say someone else who probably doesn't hold his character in his highest regards, right? So let's just get right into it, right? So, and again, very faint, I'm doing this in Golden Leaf. And really the motivating factor behind it was the replaying through of, I'd say, the first Geara sequence, you know, where he comes to Golden Leaf, you know, wreaks havoc, you banish him, right? And because that got me thinking, right? So, in terms of this character, I'd say if there were two words to describe him, it would be competence, and I don't want to say confidence because that's, you know, the very generic like duo, but I think a better term is drive. I think competence and drive are two character traits that align very well with his character. And I'll explain here in kind of the deeper meaning and how that's fleshed out his past and again the present. I think if you look solely at character attributes, Geara has an extremely impressive resume. So, I mean, just look at him compared to other admins. I mean, he's what? I know the whole joke is he's not legally allowed to drink in Unova, right? Because he's not 21. But the fact that he's 20 and a Zen executive, one who is able to step up to the plate and, again, you know, perform in that role fitting of a Zen executive, you know, the second highest in the chain of the Zen hierarchy, it is telling, you know. And then, I mean, I was going to take a drag at his height, you know, being 5'4", right? Not myself. Granted, I'm still short, 5'7", right? I got like 3 inches on this guy. But, so, very clearly from the onset, extremely young, extremely, I'd say, short-statured individual who is performing in the role of a Zen executive. I think that's something that can't be, you know, understated. And I think, you know, it shows because I think he also has one of the, you know, he has one of the, arguably, debatably, one of the greatest feats in the game in killing the Interceptor, which has only happened 4 times in the game, to our knowledge. 3 times to us, 1 time to Crescent. The one with Crescent was clearing Kieran. The one with us was, again, and the fact that he was the first person to kill us is in the only member of Team Zen to kill an Interceptor is another thing to boast, right? And then the other 2 times it's the bomb that goes off in the past, and then the 3rd time we got deleted, right? Or erased, or whatever machinery Team Blade Star used. But again, the fact that he holds one of the most impressive feats in the game just adds to that, right? Adds to that competence in drive, right? But that's just looking at obviously his character, but then, or like his, like surface level attributes. What I want to kind of, and the reason why I set the stage is I'm going to do more of a deeper dive into, okay, his past, right? And how that really, his desire for the, again, you know, competence and then drive manifest, because in Geara's interaction with Narcissa, something obviously later in the game we reveal that he looked up to Sirius, you know, and it kind of, what the game portrayed it as was like, okay, Geara took after Sirius, right? Which we knew as Vitus, right? Or learned was Vitus, and then again, you know, that explains, like, oh yeah, Geara's actually just, it's a pawn of Vitus or a pawn of Team Zen, Max, whatever. I think what's interesting in this interaction that almost disproves that, you need to remember that that's through the lens of Narcissa, through someone who has admittedly their own character flaws, and as well as almost, I don't want to say consider themselves having failed Geara or Gregory to them in a sense, but at the very least failed in their marriage in getting deceived by Sirius, which we know is Vitus. Geara seems to care for Narcissa. That might be a crazy statement, but Geara seems to care for Narcissa, right? And I think it's evident in that interaction with Geara and Narcissa, where Geara essentially calls out Narcissa for letting herself get taken advantage of by Sirius. Now, that's not a statement that someone who inherently hates, let's say, through what the game tried to tell us and through at least the lens of Narcissa, someone who hates them would say. If Geara did truly hate Narcissa, you know, and again, he hates some of the things she does, right? Like letting herself get taken advantage of by Sirius, being weak in implementing the ordinance to what he described as a backwards hick town. But if he truly hated her, he would have mocked her for that, right? He would mock her, and he would take joy and delight in seeing her get abused, right, in SmackDown. But that's not what we saw. I mean, we saw him smack the wall in anger, in that, again, he doesn't like that Narcissa lets herself get taken advantage of. For as weird as that may seem, that's what we saw. And that shows, in that interaction, a profoundly deeper character than what we see on the surface. It's just, oh, that evil Zen executive who has no redeeming qualities. The serious, I guess, ironically enough, if you were to look at Reborn, like the serious equivalent of Team Zen. I think there's more to that. And it's, again, in another thing, right? So Geara gets banished, right? He comes back. He gets beat by Crescent and then teleported, scattered into 1,000 pieces, put back together. What was the thing that, you know, he was thinking about during that time? Ultimately taking it out on us, right? And he does end up, at the end of the game, finding us and fighting us. And ultimately, we beat him, right? But at the end of the day, you know, that rage and anger, the drive, right? That's where the drive part comes in. The drive that he felt in, again, beating us as his main source of anger and strife, right? It was just no longer really there, right? And ultimately was losing that, right? He kind of needed to do some soul searching. Again, like, leaves quite possible we never see him in the future versions. This might be just the complete conclusion of his character arc. But that also shows it alongside, again, his interactions with Narcissa, something profoundly deeper, right? In that, I'd like to compare his character. Honestly, if you've seen Star Wars, I'd honestly compare his character to, it's kind of a crazy comparison, but to Darth Maul. I think they're very similar in that retrospect, right? You know, and I think here, and again, we don't know the full details of his childhood. However, we do know that Vitus, in the form of Sirius, took a keen interest in him. And from seemingly an early on age, Geara recognized, again, obviously he, you know, I don't want to say idolized Sirius, right? But he looked up to Sirius, you know, not necessarily in the sense that he was a good person. You know, I think that's if I can drive the point home, right? The point I'm trying to come across. Not because, like, this isn't a case of Geara, pure evil, looks up to Vitus and Sirius because they're evil and he likes being evil and doing evil things. I think he respects Vitus for the power and the authority that he holds and what he's able to do. I mean, the fact that he was able to essentially, because this is a very understated achievement that doesn't get like expanded upon later in the game. The fact that they were able to access the Den of Souls and use the Pokemon Giratina as a conduit to that dimension in seemingly the pursuit of immortality, which who knows, maybe Vitus was able to actually achieve, right? But Geara, again, the competence factor, being able to capitalize on that and actually capture Giratina for his own use, even if he gets beat, still being able to wield and command a legendary Pokemon, right? On akin to like what Madam X was doing with Yveltal, debatably even more so. But in terms of his view of Sirius, right? He respects him for the fact that he's able to, again, maybe Sirius himself didn't harness it, right? I mean, died in the fire 10 years in the past, but was able to identify and then actually exploit and bring about, again, like actually create Giratina, right? But not because of whatever plans he had for Giratina, but just because he in and of itself was able to do that. Because again, I stand by this. If he did look up to Vitus for the fact that he was evil, and just for the fact that he used his power for evil, you know, then he would take delight in seeing Narcissa again, you know, but that is, he respects Sirius for the power that he's able to harness and wield, but at the same time, he wants to see Narcissa, someone who quite frankly may have been on equal, at least, like, feet, I don't want to say feet-wise, but in terms of strength, who may have been someone who could be equal to Sirius, right? If she had honed her own power more, right? Or if she had honed her own potential more, is a better way to put it. But instead, fell for Sirius, you know, threw away her acting gig, which is, again, acting is a very, what I say, prominent career field, something that Geara would view in more higher esteem compared to just settling to be a housewife in a backwards hick town. And then ultimately, you know, being oblivious to what's really going on. And I don't want to say be an ineffective leader, but be a leader who couldn't prevent ultimately the failure of the isolation, right? The decree of isolation, as well as the Zen, again, and it's almost funny that, you know, Geara decries, right, that Narcissa was able to let herself get taken advantage of by Sirius, but also ends up wielding the same Pokemon that is the fruits of his labor, which, again, I think is, like, that's if there's any like sort of snippet or snapshot, or if there's any sort of just glimpse into his character, if you just take one thing over anything else, I would say the fact that he detests what Sirius did to Narcissa, but still wields the fruits of his labor. That's the perfect example in the model for his character, as, again, someone who values competence, right? You know, who is competent, right? Not necessarily in who has power, not for the sake of evil, right? But, again, for the sake of having that power, right? You know, in that, again, and in terms of what that power is used for, again, obviously, and another thing I want to bring up is, I think it's not a mistake that Geara is probably the only admin or executive that we don't see have an interaction with Madam X. I don't recall ever seeing a Geara Madam X interaction, and I don't think that's by mistake. And I think it's because ultimately he doesn't really feel, I should say, fear. That may sound like insane glaze, but that's just when, remember the scene where Madam X walks in and essentially Madam X walks in, Nastasia hides Ren behind her. I can get into Nastasia's character arc and the whole maternal sort of aspect of her and Ren, right? But, you know, and then the fact that Madam X tries to essentially kill Madalis, and then Neved has to stop her, using his, like, good grace too. And his one, I guess, freebie in that instance. But there's a noticeable absence of a Geara Madam X interaction. And I think that's because, obviously, he is an executive at Team Zen and competent, as we have seen. But again, that he doesn't have the same, like, fear. Those other aspects, because he is competent and he strives to and obtains power, not for evil, right? Like, not for evil, like, or I guess whatever otherworldly goals Madam X has, because we have no idea. Just she killed our mother, so she's evil in our book. Just up until whenever the game gets her backstory. Not to try to save his daughter like Neved. Not, you know, to try and fill a void that they weren't able to prevent, like Nastasia. Not, you know, to try and save their sister or, you know, something along the lines of why Madalis joined. But again, because he is someone who attains, or he seeks power and wants to attain power, right? And then in terms of what that drive turns into, right, is, and again, this is where I view his character very kin to Darth Maul, is essentially after he gets beat, right, and after we beat him, it turns to us and taking us down, because we are someone who is shown to be able to eclipse his power, right, and to, again, someone who is more competent than him, right, who he views as a rival. Like, if there's a rival character we would have in Team Zen, I guess debatable Madam X, but in terms, I don't even think Madam X. I think it goes to Geara, right? In terms of a rival character, one who we face off and one who we have more of a connection to. Which, funny enough, the character, at least, and it's very one-sided, as you can tell, because Geara is absent for a decent chunk of the story, and we do a lot with Madam X during that time, right? Sounds crazy out of context. But we do more with, like, other characters, right? And specifically our Team Zen characters. But in the meantime, right, as Geara is getting pieced back together, you know, we're kind of the one thing on his mind, right? As the one who is able to beat him, you know, it is about eclipsing our own power, right? And him, again, just showing that he can still be on top, right? Obviously, he would never eclipse Madam X, right? As the leader of Team Zen, that's just not a thing. It's ironic, given what, debatably, whatever Madam X's identity is, and whatever her role in the Midas storyline. And realistically, because Geara, and again, at the end of the day, I want to harp on this, Geara is a normal human being. That is something not a lot of people are in this game. And the fact that he was able to achieve and accomplish all he did, right? You know, having those feats, again, 20-year-old Zen admin, first person to kill the Interceptor, right? Able to come back twice from getting banished and essentially split into 1,000 pieces, you know, all while being just a normal human and commanding a legendary for a, albeit short period, wielding it pretty effectively, you know, all as a normal human, right? Again, it is something to be stated, and again, the fact that, you know, he's not an evil guy, right? I'd say not evil, but someone who is extremely competent and values power more than anything else. But still has what I'd say is, like, those moments, right? I think specifically, I really want to talk about this interaction more than anyone else. The one where he, again, the Geara Narcissa interaction, where he detests Narcissa for allowing Sirius to take advantage of her. Like, I think that's more human than really any other. I mean, and it's funny because at this point in the game, and it's funny because he's not even their biological kid, right? And I think that detesting comes from I don't want to say twisted, but it comes from a place of, again, you know, she wasn't able to live up to her potential in his eyes, he kind of sees her as washed versus, and obviously Sirius is dead, but someone who's able to unlock the secrets of the Den of Souls and the conduit to access it. Right? And Lord knows what his background is, but maybe, you know, I mean, we know he's Vitus, right? But from Geara's perspective, he could have been like a complete unknown who came from nothing and accomplished all that. Well, Narsa, coming from it, being an actress, right, a more prominent figure, kind of throwing that away. And again, that's just, it's something where, you know, it's something where I just want to say this. I don't think he's evil, right? And I think if they wanted to make him a generic evil, let's look at it this angle. If they want him to be a Sirius-esque character, because for me, that's Sirius's character in Reborn. I think, because I think there's a lot of similarities between the two. I consider them to both be probably the most competent admins of each of their respective teams. Ironically, and Sirius happens to be the name of the alias that Vitus took after, right? Because Sirius in Reborn is what I consider pure evil, right? He's like, again, he joins Team Meteor, right? Participates in all their acts, recruits Dr. Connell's team, again, you know, the New World Orderlies, right? You know, and essentially assists Lynn in usurping Solaris, who Solaris, we know, had a seemingly semi-noble goal, so completely derailing Team Meteor's goal for the sake of promoting Lynn and himself having a piece in the new Team Meteor, right? While also utilizing Dr. Connell electroshock therapy. Essentially, there's no redeeming qualities about Sirius, and really, I mean, he dies, right, on Victory Road. But essentially, that's who we saw as just, again, a man of pure evil. Still competent, but evil. I think with Geara's character, it's just more about the competence and power in and of itself. That I want to say husk of a man, right? But or shell of a man or husk of a person. You know, but essentially someone who still probably not the greatest upbringing. I mean, the dude doesn't, like, his actual parents, again, and the theory is that, I guess he was in the void, lost his memories, his actual parents, you know, or his mom was in the past, his dad, and clearly there's some time manipulation, because if the dude's only 20, he, again, made his way to the present, right? Or dropped off at some point not in the time he should be at. His dad lost all his memories, so essentially a blank slate. A blank slate of a person who values power and competence overall, right? Or who exudes competence and values power over all else, doesn't feel fear and doesn't feel any sort of what would be hindering emotions, right? Like, doesn't express sadness, distress, right? Really, the only emotion he has is rage and anger, which is as a result of his drive. Once we, at least in his eyes, become a rival figure and challenge and beat, you know, eclipse his own power, right? But, you know, his competence and his drive as a combination allow him to keep on moving forward. And eventually, I mean, he comes back and we fight, but, like, at that point, it's all gone, right? That anger and rage. Who knows? Maybe it was because Anastasia changed something in him when she put him back together, right? Who knows? But it could also be viewed as more of like by that point, the game, it's a completely different game. Everything that happened in the past between us is really just a forgotten memory, right? And the one thing that he kind of had going for him is now gone, and he needs that time to reflect and reevaluate his own character. And specifically when it comes to, again, at the end of the day, the fact that he didn't take joy in seeing Narcissus suffer. He didn't take joy in seeing her suffer. He felt anger, right? That's not what an evil person would feel, right? An evil person would feel joy. He felt anger. right? Because he's a blank slate. And although, again, he idolizes, at least in the words of Nastasia, but what was probably more realistic is he acknowledged Sirius's competence in what he was able to do. And I mean, in fact, he reaps the benefit of his project, right? He captures Giratina for himself, you know, but at the same time detesting him for what he did to Narcissa, and ultimately bringing Narcissa down with him, right? And in a sense, I want to say he takes after Sirius, or Vitus as we know him, but, you know, he also takes after Narcissa. I mean, like, if we're being real, the Ordinance of Isolation is an extreme move, but it was one that was probably made in an extremely similar headspace to following the incident of the Wispy Tower, one made in extremely similar headspace to Giratina in choosing us as the main drive and motivator for his anger, and again to hone his competence in a way that could drive and exude his power to eclipse even that of our own. And I'm wrapping up on nearly 30 minutes of glaze, but I really did just want to take this video, right, to talk about his character, because I do think his character is underrated, and I do think probably a lot of people, you know, don't see his character as, like, I think they would view his character in Sirius in an Sirius from Reborn, not in this Sirius from Reborn in an extremely similar way. I think there is a distinct difference, right? And I think I'm curious if we're going to get even more backstory in him. I doubt it, but I think in terms of a rough childhood and one where he sees his mother being taken advantage of and essentially being powerless really to do anything, you know, he just kind of sits there and takes it. And for him, it's almost a lessons learned to not be as weak as his mother, because which he, lo and behold, he goes and achieves. Shit, like, obviously he loses to Narcissa after, you know, let's say, after essentially losing to the circus quartet or whatever, right? But really, if we're looking at his character, right, just in a vacuum, you know, I think blank slate's a really good way to put it. Blank slate that gets filled by competence and his drive. And I do genuinely think, and this is going to be my final thought, I think a conversation between Geara and Madam X would go like a normal conversation, like between like you and me, the viewer. I don't think Geara would have that same fear. He wouldn't have the same, I mean, subservience, I want to say. You know, obviously he brings up Madam X, but more so as a way to entice Dr. Jenner. Like, and I think that's a perfect example in that Aether round, right? Where Zeta kind of gives up and Jenner is out of it. Geara is immediately thinking of how to get out and how to get back at us, right? Which they end up accomplishing through Nim, which again was seemingly another Geara, you know, idea to try to, you know, break that barrier between the worlds, which they do accomplish, you know. But I'm gonna end it here. I spent 30 minutes talking about him, and I've repeated a lot of my points, but I just hope that, you know, I'm able to spread the love for this character, because I do think he is one that's underappreciated, and one that probably gets overlooked for other Zen executives. But with that, I'm gonna end it here. That's all I have for this one. See you in the next one.